Last week on Face the Nation, Senator Chris Coons called for stronger U.S. military action in support of Ukraine, telling Margaret Brennan that he fears Ukraine could become the next Syria. Let's watch.
This is a critical moment. If Vladimir Putin, who has shown us how brutal he can be, is allowed to just continue to massacre civilians, to commit war crimes throughout Ukraine, without NATO, without the West coming more forcefully to his aid, I deeply worry that what's going to happen next is that we will see Ukraine turn into Syria. Mm-hmm. The American people cannot turn away from this tragedy in Ukraine.
Joining us now with her initial reaction is Katie Halper. She's the host of The Katie Halper Show and co-host of the Useful Idiots podcast. It's good to see you, Katie.
Thanks, you too.
So what is your initial reaction here? Is the drum of war ever going to stop being beat by these Congress members? How much is enough for these people? Does it have to get to World War III levels?
Well, it's interesting. So right before that quote that we saw, that clip of Coons, what we have is Margaret Brennan of Face the Nation quoting him, saying that he had made public statements saying that we had to, the U.S. had to talk about boots on the ground. So it's even more belligerent than that clip shows. And I think that, as you pointed out, it is a drum, they are beating the drum for war. This will potentially, of course, could lead to World War III, although people are talking about it in ways that you'd never know because they're being so casual about it. And is Chris Coons going to send his kids to fight? Are the boots on the ground going to belong to his children? I doubt it. I think it's a scary moment. I mean, in some ways, I appreciate that they're saying the quiet parts out loud, which is that they could be actually considering this. And I think that's luckily, I think American people have no appetite for that. I think we're war fatigued, but it's a scary moment that this is even in the discourse and that Chris Coons wants this to be more in the discourse than it already is. And in terms of turning it into Syria, what's interesting is that the United States is already in some ways treating this conflict the way it treats Syria. I mean, we're funding a proxy war, much like we did in Syria, and we're flooding the country with weapons that are winding up in the hands of some pretty unsavory characters, that happened in Syria, and that's happening now in Ukraine with the Azov battalion. And I'm not saying that the entire Ukrainian army military is Azov battalion, which is the neo-Nazi battalion, which is officially incorporated into the Ukrainian military, which is a scary thing. But people are flying around from the world who we know have kind of right-wing, extreme right, some neo-Nazi people are joining this fight. So it's a very scary moment. And this is escalation.
Yeah, and it kind of makes me wonder if we're going to get to a point where, rather than sending, I don't know if we'll ever get, hopefully not, to a point where we send actual American military over there. But I wouldn't put it past these lawmakers to want to send over contractors, military contractors. Right. And putting them on the ground. We already know that we do have Americans on the ground in that war. I mean, I don't know if it's well known or publicized, but there have been reports of like CIA and other people that are on the ground, and they're talking about sharing that intelligence with Ukraine, which I'm sure they're already starting to do. And so that would be, they're trying to figure out how far can they go. And this is where it's crazy. This is where it gets scary. How far can they go before they trigger a war, an actual direct war with Russia? Before Russia says, I've had it with you and I'm going to bomb, because that's how it would begin, right? I mean, Russia would say, I've had it with you and I'm going to bomb now someplace that is obviously a direct war with the United States because you're already in a direct war with us. And then, of course, that'll be painted as Russia started the war with America, that they came after us, when in reality, we've got people on the ground and we've been inching our way and figuring out, can we do this? Can we do that? Can we do this? So what do you think? I mean, what would you guess is going to, I hate to play this game, but what do you guess is going to happen? Biden, what do you think of Biden and his stance on everything? Seems like he's at least trying to reel it back.
Yeah, I think he realizes, although he, of course, said that thing about how they had to get rid of Putin, which many people took as regime change. And I actually think that is what's happening now. I think that they are trying to, they're not interested in diplomacy or de-escalation or brokering a peace. They've been very hands-offish on that, as we've seen. And I think that what they're trying to do is they view this war as a possibility to weaken Putin as much as possible. They keep talking about how they're wrecking the economy with sanctions. And this is what motivated them in Syria as well. They weren't interested in helping negotiate a peace. They were interested in using this to regime change Assad. They failed at that, but not before helping devastate the country. So that's another parallel. That's what we're seeing. Really, there is no urgency around this, and that's why they keep saying it's going to be a long haul. It's going to last a long time. I mean, they're prepared to use Ukraine and Ukrainians as pawns, which is why I get so upset when people claim that this is about Ukrainian civilians. I mean, I think for lots of well-meaning people, they see it that way, and they're rooting for Ukrainians, and that's great. But that's definitely not what is motivating the U.S. government or the arms industry that determines and shapes so much of our policy.
Well, Katie, let me ask you about that. It seems so obvious to all of us sitting here and to so many experts who've been on this show and your show and all of our shows that the obvious implication of sending Americans, having people from NATO countries in the country fighting, having Malcolm Nance and people like that on the ground is that we could end up in a direct conflict that sparks a civil war, World War III. Why do you think people are still pushing like Chris Coons is pushing here? Is it purposeful? Is it because that's an outcome that they want because they see the upsides in terms of military contracts or what have you as worth the risk of nuclear threat? Or do you think it comes from ignorance or naivete?
I actually think it's slightly different. I think that it's their attempt, either consciously or subconsciously perhaps, but to shift the Overton window to a more war-ready place so that when we do fund this proxy war and when we flood this area with weapons and when we don't broker a peace deal, which we really could have done that before this happened, and we certainly could have done it from the beginning of the war, and we could still do it now. I think then this becomes, it's presented as more reasonable. And like I've done this too. I'm like, oh, well, at least Biden doesn't want World War III. That really shouldn't, that's a pretty high, low bar. And it's pretty pathetic. So when you have lawmakers calling for discussing something even more belligerent, which should be off the table, I think it still is scary and can have implications that could lead to, people have been calling for a no-fly zone, which could really provoke World War III. But I think people are playing with fire. But I think perhaps what they are really trying to do is just make our funding of a war and our involvement in a war, this proxy war, seem more palatable because at least it's not boots on the ground.
So you think that they think it's not actually going to happen, that Joe Biden is a reliable bulwark against that eventuality, and so therefore they have the freedom to be kind of a maximalist about what they're calling for?
Maybe, but they are really playing with fire because Biden, as we know, is not the most disciplined. He doesn't have great message discipline when he's speaking, and who knows what he could say that could provoke a response from Putin, right? That's why I think that even if they're not expecting boots on the ground, and again, I should be clear, I don't know. I mean, they could actually be considering boots on the ground. They could be fantasizing about more engagement. I guess that was maybe wishful thinking. I guess what I should say is that no matter what, the effect of introducing these potential plans of military engagement do have the effect of like sanitizing what we're already doing, and people don't realize that we're already involved in a proxy war that we're making happen, we're funding it, and we help create the conditions, and we certainly are not doing all that we could to end it.
Well, thank you.
Well, we got to keep feeding that military-industrial complex, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. And it's hard for me to take Chris Coons that seriously when it comes to democracy because he's a huge defender of Israel and likes to point it out as a democracy, which we know definitionally it's not. You don't have to hate Israel to see that.
Well, thank you as always for your insights, Katie. I appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you.
And we'll have more Rising after this.